Hey y'all, we are back in the garden today to discuss plans for next year's garden based on how this season went, and I'm already thinking about what I'm going to do differently next year. I like to do this in September because we are at the edge of the summer and fall season with plants just past their peak, and it also gives me time to make the changes that I want before the cold weather really starts to roll in. Before I get into my planting details, I'm also going to be planting beets for the first time today, so let's get that started first.
I am setting up my beet bed right next to one of my lettuce beds. I like to group the cool weather crops together when I can because it's easier to just water them all at once in one section of the garden, and it'll be easier to cover them when the frost comes. Here I am removing the wood chip mulch layer with the flat end of my hoe, and I will be laying down my compost and topsoil mixture before I plant my seeds. Like I mentioned, this is my first time growing beets in my garden. I am really looking forward to it. But the reason I never planted them before is because I did not like the ones I've tried in the past, which were from a can. So I assumed that's how they all tasted. And if I do not like it, then I certainly do not grow it in my garden. And the ones I tried, I thought they tasted just like dirt. I was convinced to try them when a good friend of mine said that fresh beets are very, very sweet, so I thought I'd give them a go this year. If I'm being honest, I wish I tried growing beets earlier because they are a great fall season crop, and I don't think they'll take up too much space since my main summer crops are dying back. Although I have never grown them before, I do know a few things that if you want to grow beets, they need to be directly sown into the soil in spring or late summer. They are a root vegetable, so you want to avoid disrupting the roots, and this is why you should always directly sow them. It is best to sow the beet seeds into fresh soil, which is why I like to use my compost and topsoil mixture. Once I have my desired amount laid out to about 1 to 2 inches deep, I am going to use my hoe again to make sure it is good and even. You'll notice me rearranging the mulch back around the soil I just laid. Now, I could layer it back on top of the soil, but I think I'll wait until the seedlings emerge. One thing I am considering doing differently in preparation for my garden next year that I have also never tried before is growing cover crops. Ideally, I would grow them this fall in the areas where I did not use my wood chip mulch to help restore the soil, but also to protect it next year as mulch when it dies back in the spring. This is, however, a completely new concept to me, so I have been doing my research, but I think it's worth a shot because mulching has really helped me maintain good soil and plant health, and I've noticed a difference in the plants that I neglected to mulch this season. Here I am pre-soaking the soil like I do for all of my seeds before I dig my trenches and plant my seeds. I am going to plant them about a ½ inch deep and several inches apart. When they sprout to about an inch or two, I will have to thin them because the seeds are more of a cluster rather than a single seed. So I do not want them growing right on top of each other. I plan to thin them about 3 or 4 inches apart so they have enough room to grow. Another fact I know about beets is that the colder the weather they grow in, the sweeter they will get, which is why it's best to grow them in cooler months like in the spring and in the fall. Because this is my first time growing them, I am really relying on the seed packet for the instructions. The seed packet did mention that the beet seedlings can take 2 to 3 weeks to germinate, which I thought was an interestingly long time. So they should be ready to harvest in about 8 weeks or so, and for me, that will be around early November. I have no fancy technique for my beet seeds. Here I am just plopping them into the trenches I just dug. I will gently cover them back up, and I always like to give them another good watering so the seeds settle into the soil nicely. While on the topic of growing new plants, I also plan to grow more variety in my garden next year, such as more peppers, flowers, and I want to try growing melons again. I did try growing watermelon in the past, but it did not yield good results. However, I certainly not want to give up on that because who doesn't love fresh melons in the summer? When it comes to planning, essentially what I do is take a step back and reevaluate the garden regarding the setup, how plants grew, what worked, and what didn't. As things slowly die back, I like to take a moment to envision how I want to set up next summer's garden by seeing how it looks now with most things in full bloom or just past their peak. Sometimes I also like to do a rough sketch of the new garden layout to visualize and adjust depending on how the rest of the season progresses. I have also found that taking pictures, videos of how the garden looks now from different angles can be helpful to look back on and refer to in the future. It can be exciting to experiment and try new things in the garden, but it's also a normal part of the process to learn from what didn't go as expected, no matter how much planning you did. All I know is that I am constantly learning and growing in the garden alongside my plants, and it gets better and better year after year. Now that my beets are planted, I can elaborate on the things I plan on doing differently. I have 3 berry bushes that have been very neglected this past year since my main focus was getting the main garden up and running. So I want to bring them inside the garden, and I'm going to place them in the corners. So if we need to put up netting, it'll be easier because they're already protected on at least 2 sides. I think in the corners they'll also take up less space so they have room to grow. I also plan to slightly rotate the tomato plants, which is a good practice to avoid returning blight since some research suggests that it can survive in the soil and impact your plants the following year. I want to plant less tomatoes since 50 was way too many this year. With less tomatoes in the garden, I'll be able to plant other things. Another space saving idea I have is trellising the squash vertically up and over the fence so they do not take up as much ground area. I am also considering omitting corn from the garden this year because every year we have tried it, it just does not do well. If I do decide to grow it, I figured it would do well here behind the raised beds, so at least it doesn't take up too much space. Here I am moving the blueberry bush into its new corner. I plan to transplant the blueberry and the 2 raspberry plants in the fall when they have gone dormant to avoid any shock. Again, planning ahead in September is ideal to be set up for success next spring. Let me know what you plan on doing differently, and happy gardening.